When people ask me what real youth feels like, I never think of a first love or prom night. I think of a smell. The smell of a mildewed map, cigarette smoke, and canned beef stew heated right on the iron radiator in our room on the 4th floor of the geology dorm. 5 of us lived in a room meant for 3. Nobody had a problem with that. The cots were pushed up side by side, and under each one lay backpacks, rock samples, somebody's boots. The building manager, Zinaida Pavlovna, knocked on the door once a week and threatened to have us expelled. We'd open up, smile, promise to clean the place. She'd leave. Everything stayed exactly as it was. There were 5 of us. Me, Sergei Larine, skinny back then, always wearing glasses, fingers permanently stained with ink. Vitka Osipov, loud, red-headed, from Sverdlovsk, with a laugh that made the window panes rattle. Kolya Bezrukov, quiet, careful, never without a book. Lyosha Pankratov, our unofficial leader, a year older than the rest of us, had done his military service before college. And Tanya, the only girl in our group, a rock hammer on her belt, and a look in her eyes that made idiots think twice about coming near. Junior year, spring of '81, exams done, barely, but done. That's when a piece of paper appeared on the bulletin board. An ordinary sheet torn from a notebook, written out by hand in blue ballpoint. The petrology department was putting together a group for a summer field expedition. The Altai Mountains, July. Participation voluntary, but strongly encouraged. Vitka pulled the sheet off the board and carried it back to the room, holding it between 2 fingers like something precious. The Altai Mountains, he said, and went quiet. Nothing else needed to be said. Packing took 2 weeks. They were the best 2 weeks of that year. We passed equipment lists back and forth, argued about sleeping bags. Kolya drew up a route map from an atlas he'd tracked down in the reading room. Lyosha taught us to tie knots, seriously, methodically, as though our lives depended on it. Maybe they did. I remember standing at the dorm window the night before we left, looking down at the courtyard. It was close to midnight, warm out, and the air smelled of cottonwood fluff drifting off the poplars. Somebody was riding a bicycle around down below. I thought, this is it. It's starting. The thing I decided on 5 years ago, back when I was still a kid in school and I read a book about geologists and made up my mind that was the only life for me. I was 20 years old. I wasn't afraid of anything in the world. That, I suppose, is what youth is. The village was called Ust-Kamenka. 30-odd houses sunken into the ground up to their windowsills, vegetable gardens behind crooked fences, one unnamed street. The bus dropped us off in front of the store, a gray wooden building with a sign that read, Groceries. The letter G half peeled away. The locals watched us without much interest. City kids with backpacks were apparently nothing new around here. Arkhip was pointed out to us by the village council chairman himself, a short, bald man in a sport coat worn over a sailor's undershirt. All he said was, "Go find Arkhip Savliich, last house down by the river. There's no other guide anyway." Then he thought for a moment and added, "He's ornery, but he knows the way." The last house by the river turned out to be the neatest in the whole village. The garden was weeded, the woodpile stacked straight, and an old man was sitting on the porch sharpening a knife. He didn't even look up when we walked over. "Hello," said Leosha. "We were told you might be able to guide us along the route. We're geologists, a student expedition, the petrology department." "I know," said the old man. "5 of you. The girl coming too?" Tanya opened her mouth. Leosha quietly touched her elbow. "She's coming," he said. Arkip finally raised his head. His face looked like it had been drying in mountain wind for about 40 years. Dark, deeply creased, with white eyebrows above very pale eyes. His age was impossible to place. Could have been 60, could have been 80. "Tomorrow, 5 in the morning," he said. "Anybody late? I leave without them." The next morning we were standing at his gate at 4:50. Arkip came out at exactly 5, not a second off, with a backpack that looked older than all of us put together. I remember the first days of the trek as one long, unbroken rush of happiness. The mountains I'd only ever seen in pictures turned out to be nothing like those pictures. They were alive, uneven, and smelled of rock and cold water. The trail climbed steeply and then dropped without warning. By evening, my legs ached so badly that I'd fall asleep before I'd even finished pulling myself into my sleeping bag. Arkip walked out front, steady, no wasted motion, never looking back. He set a pace that had Vitka for all his physical shape, going quiet by the middle of the second day, just walking with his eyes on the ground. Arkip didn't push us, didn't wait for us. He simply moved, and we moved behind him. He didn't talk much. At rest stops, he answered questions. Briefly, precisely, no extras. "What's that peak called?" "You can drink from here, not from there. Rain tomorrow." The rain always came. I watched him on the sly. There was something about him I couldn't name at the time. A kind of inner quiet, not indifference, but quiet specifically, as though he'd long ago worked everything out and was now simply living. Once, the third day I think, he stopped on a ridgeline where the trail bent east and stood for a few seconds looking in the other direction, to the north, without a word. Then he moved on. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I should have. By the end of the first week, we had found our footing. That phrase sounds simple enough, but it stands for a whole process you can't explain to anyone who's never worked in the field. The body stops complaining. The blisters toughen up. The backpack that felt like torture at the first rest stop becomes part of you. You take it off in the evening and feel a strange lightness, almost weightlessness. You wake up at 5 in the morning, not because of an alarm, but because that's how it has to be. Because your body already knows. The day is about to begin. Our route was a training exercise, but a real one. We collected rock samples from outcrops, described cross-sections, sketched into our field notebooks everything Kolya called stratigraphically significant. Leosha kept the sample log, neatly, with numbers and coordinates tied to points on the map. Tanya turned out to be the best field geologist among us. She had some kind of natural eye for it. She could see things in an ordinary rock face that I would have walked right past without noticing. Vitka was a different person out in the field. All that loudness went somewhere. He became focused, almost meticulous. But in the evenings by the fire, he was the same red-headed clown as always, the storyteller, the one who got everybody laughing. Without him, the evenings would have been something else entirely. The campfire deserves its own story. After the day's route, after dinner, whatever we'd managed to cook on the camp stove or straight over the flames, we'd sit around it and simply exist. No TV, no radio, just the fire and the darkness all around and the mountains you could make out by their silhouettes against the sky. The conversations were different from anything we had back in the city, more honest somehow. Kolya told us one night about the father he'd never met. Tanya talked about why she'd chosen geology when her mother had wanted her to go into education. I listened and thought that this must be how people actually become close, not in city kitchens, but right here, by a fire, when there's nowhere to go and no reason to. Arkip took almost no part in those conversations. He sat a little off to the side, drank tea from his tin mug, and stared into the fire. Sometimes something we said made him smile faintly, but he kept quiet. We had gotten used to it by then and didn't take it personally. But on the 9th day I noticed again what I'd seen before on the ridgeline. We had stopped to rest on a wide rocky ledge eating bread and fatback while Vitka told some story about girls back in Sverdlovsk. Arkip stood up, walked to the edge of the shelf and stood looking out to the north for a long time. A long time. 3 minutes at least. Then he came back and finished his tea. Arkip Savlyich, I asked quietly, what's out there to the north? He looked at me, said nothing for a moment. Nothing, he said. Not anymore. I didn't understand what he meant. Nothing as in empty, or nothing as in none of your business. I didn't ask again. Something in his tone made me stop. That same evening the rain set in. We crawled under the tarp, packed in tight, shoulder to shoulder. Arkip coaxed a fire going under the overhang and put the kettle on. The rain drummed against the canvas, steady and low. That's when he started talking. He started without any preamble, just set his mug down on a rock, looked into the fire and said, "There's a settlement not far from here, called Malikamen, or there was." The rain fell steadily. Nobody moved. About 12 kilometers north, in a hollow between two ridges. Quiet place, sheltered. Good river, good soil. About 30 years ago, some people went out there, left on their own, of their own free will. 30 people, give or take. Families, children, old folks. Not fugitives, not criminals. They just decided to live apart. Away from the collective farm, away from the city, away from all of it. Vitka looked like he wanted to say something. I could tell. But he kept quiet. Arkip spoke evenly, without any particular inflection, the way you'd read something aloud that you learned a long time ago. They set themselves up well, built solid log houses, kept gardens, raised livestock, hunted, had children. The authorities knew about them, but left them alone, too far out, not worth the trouble. And the people were quiet, didn't stick their noses in anywhere, never asked for anything. lived by their own means. He picked up his mug, held it in both hands, set it back down. About 10 years after they'd settled in, a hunter from our village was passing through that hollow. Wanted to stop in, asked for some tobacco, so he stopped in and found nobody. Tanya asked quietly, "What do you mean, nobody?" "Just that. The houses were standing. The stoves were still warm," he said. "Food on the tables, not cleared away. In one house there was a spinning wheel with the thread wound halfway onto the bobbin, like the woman of the house had just gotten up and stepped out. Livestock in the barn, alive, unfed, making noise, but no people, not one person. No sign that anyone had packed up and left. No notes, nothing." The rain outside picked up for a moment, then leveled off again. Kolya sat completely still. "Did they search?" asked Lyosha. "They searched. The local constable came out. People came from the district office. They combed the hollow, went through the woods all around. Nobody. Then they closed the case. Wrote something about a voluntary departure, resettlement. Paper will put up with anything." Arkip was quiet for a moment. "Only that hunter afterward. He said that in one of the houses, the one at the far end, the door was open. And on the threshold there were a pair of children's boots. Small ones, set down neatly. The way you set them down before bed." Nobody said anything. The fire crackled. "There was all kinds of talk after that," he went on. "Some people said it was a sect, that they'd done away with themselves and hidden the bodies. Others said the military had taken them. There had been some kind of testing in those mountains and they'd gotten rid of the witnesses. Others said they'd left on their own, gone deeper into the mountains, away from people altogether, that they're still living up there." He raised his eyes from the fire and looked at us, one at a time, each of us in turn. "I don't go to those parts," he said plainly. "Haven't for a long time." And he said nothing more. He picked up his mug, leaned back against the rock, and closed his eyes. The conversation was over. We stayed quiet for a long time. The rain fell all night. In the morning the rain was gone. The mountains stood clean and washed, the air so sharp and cold it caught in your throat. We cooked porridge and acted as though the conversation from the night before hadn't been anything in particular. Vitka was whistling something. Kolya was fussing over the map. Tanya was fixing a strap on her backpack. Everything as usual. But at breakfast, Vitka was the first to crack. He was always like that. Thoughts traveled from his head to his mouth without any stops along the way. "Arkip Savliich," he said deliberately offhand, eyes on his bowl. "How far is that Mali Cayman of yours?" Arkip was drinking his tea. He didn't answer right away. 12 kilometers, he said finally. "I said so last night." "Well, 12 isn't much of a detour." Vitka looked up and flashed his disarming red-headed grin. "We could take a look, there and back in a day." Arkip set down his mug. "No." "But why? It's just an abandoned settlement. Historically interesting even." "Vitya," said Lyosha. "I'm just saying." "Vitya." Silence. Arkip looked at the fire. I figured the conversation was over, but then Tanya spoke up. She had a way of talking that made it hard to say no. She didn't push, didn't try to wear you down, just laid things out calmly and looked you in the eye. "Arkhip Savaliich," she said, "we understand that you don't want to go, and we're not going to pressure you. But if you won't come with us, we'll go on our own. We have a compass and a map. 12 kilometers in good weather is 4 hours out. We'll be back before dark." Arkhip turned his head and looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "There are 5 of us," Leosha added quietly, "and 1 experienced guide. 6 is better than 5. The old man was silent for a full 2 minutes. An actual 2 minutes, I counted to myself. Then he stood up, brushed off his knees, and looked north. "We leave in an hour," he said. "Travel light. Bring water and food for the day. Don't touch anything out there, don't take anything. Anyone who falls behind, I don't come looking." Vitka caught my eye and gave a quick, triumphant wink. I didn't share his enthusiasm. Something had been sitting quietly and uncomfortably inside me since early morning, like a pebble in your boot. Not fear exactly, but something that felt like fear getting ready to arrive. We packed up fast and without talking. Arkhip walked out front as always, but his pace was different. Not the steady trail pace, but something careful. The way you walk when you don't want to make noise. There was no path. He guided us by his own landmarks. The shape of the ridge lines, the course of a stream, signs that only he could read. The farther north we went, the more noticeably the forest changed. Not all at once, gradually, but it changed. The trees grew denser, their canopies closing overhead. There were fewer birds. At first I didn't pay attention, but then I realized I hadn't heard anything for a long time except our footsteps and the wind. No birdsong, no woodpeckers, just silence. The ground underfoot turned softer, darker. Vitka was walking beside me and not saying a word. He'd stopped whistling. Beyond the last rise, Arkhip stopped and turned around. His face was closed off as always, but his eyes were different. "We're here," he said. I looked up and saw them below, in the hollow, among the trees, dark rectangular shapes. We descended in silence. Arkhip walked slowly, almost reluctantly. Not like a guide, but like a man being led somewhere against his will. I looked down at those dark rectangular shapes among the trees and tried to figure out what exactly was bothering me about them. Then I understood. They were wrong. Not collapsed, not leaning. Wrong specifically because the forest was growing through them, not around them, not beside them. Through them. A birch tree came straight up out of a hole in the roof of one house and reached for the sky as though the house were simply ground to it. We entered the settlement from the side where the street had once been. You could make it out. 2 rows of houses with a space between them, overgrown now with tall grass and young aspens. 8 houses on one side, 7 on the other. I counted automatically, the way you count something you can hold on to. The first house stood with its door open. Not flung open, just open, the way you leave a door when you've stepped out for a minute and will be right back. Leosha stepped inside and we followed. It was light in there. Part of the roof had caved in, and daylight poured through the gap. A table, a bench, a stove with a cracked side. On the table, a bowl, a wooden spoon, a mug. Everything coated in a thick layer of dust, but sitting exactly where it had always sat, as though the owner had gotten up from the table, walked outside, and 20 years had passed since then. In the corner, a small icon, darkened with age. Below it, dried flowers. Not even flowers anymore, just a gray bundle of dust. Tanya touched them with her finger and pulled her hand back immediately. They crumbled silently. We went back outside and continued up the street. I kept my eyes on the ground and tried not to think about the children's boots Arkip had mentioned. Tried and couldn't. In one house, a tree had pushed up straight through the floor and out through the roof. A thick, mature spruce, 15 years old at least. It stood in the middle of the room like it owned the place, and all around it the remnants of a life. An overturned stool, a child's shoe, just one, no pair. I looked at it and felt something unpleasant settle low in my stomach. I walked past. Arkip didn't go into any of the houses. He stood outside, smoking, looking at the ground. I went up to him at the third house. "When were you last here?" "Never," he said. "I've never been here. I only know where it is." That surprised me for some reason. I had assumed he'd seen all this before, but no. It turned out he had brought us to a place he himself had never set foot in. I wanted to ask why, but I let it go. The silence in the settlement was its own particular kind. Not simply the absence of sound, something dense pressing against your ears from inside. Kolya said afterward that his ears had been plugging up, like in a change of air pressure. Mine too. I didn't tell anyone that at the time. Vitka walked ahead, peering into windows and doorways. He wasn't smiling anymore. He moved carefully, the way you move in an unfamiliar place where you don't know what's underfoot. We reached the middle of the street. The settlement was quiet all around us. The treetops swayed in the wind, but down below, between the houses, the air was completely still. Not a single blade of grass moved. I stopped and looked around. 5 people, an abandoned settlement, broad daylight. Everything explainable, everything accounted for. But something was wrong. Something I didn't have a name for then. Vitka saw it first. We were standing roughly in the middle of the street, and I was looking at the roof of one of the houses, where the rafters had collapsed inward and jutted out like ribs. Vitka was a little ahead of me, maybe 5 paces, at the last house on the left side. The door there was closed, the only closed door in the whole settlement. I'd noticed it when we first came in. He stopped abruptly. I watched his back go rigid. "Vitya?" I said quietly. He didn't answer for 3 seconds. Then he turned around slowly. His face looked strange. Not frightened, but like he was trying to convince himself he hadn't seen what he'd seen. "There's someone standing in that doorway," he said. "I saw them. They were looking at us." We all turned toward the closed door. Nothing. Old wood, darkened by time and moisture. An iron bracket where a handle should have been. Silence. You imagined it, said Leosha. His voice was steady, but I knew him well enough. He talked like that when he wasn't sure himself. No, said Vitka. I didn't imagine it. Someone was standing there, in the gap between the door and the frame, looking out. Arkip, who had been standing slightly behind us the whole time, said quietly, "We're leaving." "Hold on," said Leosha. "We should check. If there's someone in there, a person, a vagrant, anyone." "We're leaving," Arkip repeated. No change in his voice, but Leosha went quiet. I stared at the closed door. I very badly wanted it to stay closed. I understood this clearly, more clearly than any rational desire to investigate or find an explanation. Just don't open, please. The door didn't open, but we didn't leave right away. Leosha was Leosha. He couldn't walk away from something unresolved. He went up to the door, grabbed the bracket, and pulled. The door gave way with a drawn-out creak that tore through the silence like a knife through cloth. Inside it was dark. A smell came out. Dampness and something else. Something old and uninhabited but not dead. The smell of a cellar that no one has been in for a long time but that hasn't rotted yet. Nobody. An empty room. An overturned bench. A stove with its door hanging open. In the corner, rags that had once been a blanket. That was all. "See?" Leosha said to Vitka. "Nobody." Vitka nodded, but I noticed he didn't step inside. He stood on the threshold and looked at the exact spot where the door met the frame, where he had seen the silhouette. We left the house and moved on down the street. And that's when something started that I still can't explain, no matter how I've tried. The feeling of being watched. Not from that house, not from any specific place, from everywhere at once. A steady, calm, absolutely relentless sense that we were being observed. I looked around. Nothing. I looked at the windows, empty dark gaps. I looked at the doorways, darkness. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like pressure between my shoulder blades, physical, almost warm. I looked at the others and understood. They felt the same thing. We had drawn together, without saying so, without any agreement. We had simply ended up close to one another, shoulder to shoulder. Tanya was walking right beside me, and I was glad of it. Kolya stared straight ahead and didn't turn his head. I could see that he wasn't turning specifically because he was afraid of what he might see. Arkip said quietly without looking back, "Don't run, we walk steady." We walked steady. It was probably the hardest thing I had ever done up to that point in my life. Every step. Steady, not faster, not slower. The street ended. The forest took us back. The feeling of being watched let go only when the settlement disappeared behind the trees, all at once sharply, as though someone had looked away. Nobody said anything. We just walked. We made it back to camp before dark. Arkip built the fire, quietly, automatically, the way he did every evening. Put the kettle on, sat down, and from that moment on, he never said another word about Mally Kamen. Not that night, not the next day, not for the rest of the route. As though the story by the fire had never happened, as though we had never gone anywhere. We kept quiet, too. We didn't talk about it among ourselves. Not that evening, not in the morning, not later when we were heading back down to the village. There was something about that day that no one wanted to touch with words. Like pressing your tongue against a sore tooth. You know better, but something pulls you toward it anyway. We left it alone. Vitka tried once, at the last rest stop before the descent, while we sat waiting for the water to boil. He said something like, "So what was that anyway?" Didn't even ask it as a question, just said it into the air. Nobody answered. He stirred his tea, looked at the mountains, and never brought it up again. In the village, we spent the night at the same woman's house as before. The bus came in the morning. Arkip stood at his gate watching us load our packs. Leosha went over, shook his hand, said something. Arkip nodded. When the bus pulled away, I turned and saw him through the back window, standing there, watching us go. Then the road curved and he was gone. I never saw him again. I don't know whether he was still alive 10 years later. Most likely not. At his age, it wasn't worth calculating. But I think about him sometimes. I think about what it was like to live all those years next to that place. Going about his business, looking north from the ridgelines, knowing that Hollow was out there with its dark houses and its silence that pressed against your ears, and never going, and never telling anyone, until that evening with us. I've wondered why he told us at all. I never worked that out. The fall of that year passed the way falls do. Classes, exams, the dorm. The 5 of us saw each other every day, but when we talked about the expedition, we talked about other things. The rock formations, the route, how Kolya had nearly slipped off a wet boulder at the second pass. The good things. Molly came and sat somewhere at the bottom, weighed down by ordinary life, and barely made itself known. Barely. Sometimes at night in that same dorm room, I'd lie on my back staring at the ceiling and suddenly feel it again. The pressure between my shoulder blades. Steady, calm, relentless. I'd roll onto my side, pull the blanket up, and tell myself, "It's memory. It's only memory. This is how it works." I'd fall asleep. By morning, it would be gone. Many years passed. I became a geologist, a real one, a field geologist. I've covered ground that most people don't even know the names of. I've seen things that were strange and unexplainable, in the mountains, in the taiga, in deserts. The earth is vast and holds a great deal that doesn't fit into any textbook. I stopped being surprised by that a long time ago. But that feeling in Malikaman, I've never explained it to myself, not for lack of trying. I've tried many times, built theories, looked for logic, offered myself rational explanations. The acoustics of the hollow, mass suggestion after Arkip's story, tricks of shadow in empty windows. Any of that could have been true. Probably that's exactly what it was. But I remember how Vitka stood at that door with his back gone rigid. I remember how we drew together without a word between us. I remember how the feeling of being watched released all at once, sharply, the moment the trees closed around the settlement, as though someone had simply stopped looking, because we had gone far enough, because there was no longer any point. I'm 63 years old now. I've seen a great deal, and there's little that surprises me. but if someone steps up behind me without making a sound, I flinch every time. Still, that's probably the answer right there.